Why don't you tell us your name, introduce yourself, and share your NF journey?
My name is Lenee, and I am the mother of 3 children. Our middle child is a daughter who has NF1. We learned that probably about at 9 months of age. She had a very astute pediatrician that noticed some spots on her and suggested that we get that evaluated, and we did. And we ended up at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago with Dr. Listernick, and that they confirmed that there, and with a couple of other tests. And now she's a college age student, and there's definitely been challenges to, through all the different phases of life, but that's kind of the basics of our NF journey.
Could you share with us specifically how it presented in her or some of the challenges she's faced throughout life?
Honestly, we had it was relatively uninvolved for many, many years. We would go in for annual checks, and by all standards, it was an incredibly mild case of NF. Roundabout when she turned 10, we did have some unusual symptoms that we decided to bring up at an appointment, and they actually thought that there was some sort of a digestive issue that was happening. And when we kind of did a bunch of tests to eliminate other options before we started treating for that, they actually discovered that she had not only a fairly large tumor on the right side of her brain, but she also had what appeared to be a very large tumor in the temporal lobe on the left side of her brain. Up until this point, other than taking forever to eat, we hadn't seen really any indication in school that she was struggling. Language skills were fine. So that was a very surprising revelation, because there was really nothing up until that time that would have indicated there was any issue of that magnitude. So the one issue had to be kind of left and watched. The other issue was surgically handled when she was 12 years old, and she had actually a very large portion of her temporal lobe removed in that surgery. And ironically, it turned out not to be a tumor. It was something called cortical dysplasia, which is a congenital issue that she'd had since birth. It was just that up until that point, it had not really caused any issue. Also, by the grace of God, the surgery did not affect her in any way negatively. There was no loss of function, loss of anything like that. So, so that was very fortunate. It was actually mild seizures that were happening, which was kind of what triggered the appointments. Those seizures were alleviated by that surgery. The next part of our road was about 3 years later. In a checkup from that surgery, they actually did find an optic glioma, which was very, very late in the phase. That typically is found much, much, much earlier, and it had never appeared up until then. So that has also been in a watch and wait situation ever since, and it is not changed with any significance. So nothing has had to be done about that. And then unfortunately, the seizures did return unexpectedly several years later, but have been managed with medication. It was actually a one-time situation that happened several years ago and has not recurred since. So, like many people's journey, I think it's just fraught with a lot of, you think you're through one thing and then something else happens, and you think you've conquered something and something else happens, but you get a lot of downtime in between sometimes where nothing is happening. So it's a very strange thing to deal with, because it just doesn't have a standard path. And so you don't know, there's no real plan. The plan is ever fluid, is what we've learned.
So for your daughter specifically, she didn't have any learning disabilities or muscle delays or?
No, the only real physical thing that was happening at all, which actually ironic, and it's funny, it was for several years, our big concern was scoliosis. She started to show us like curvature in her spine fairly early on. She started being seen for that by the orthopedic specialist with Lurie that handles that. And that was where all our focus was when all of the other stuff kind of appeared. So we were concerned because she was young when it happened, and as she continued to grow, the concern was the curvature would be worse. So in our mind, we were thinking, oh, she's going to have to wear a brace for a while or something like that. And that seemed, like this really horrible thing, and then the spine straightened itself out and we were on to something much larger and completely different. That was not where we were looking at the time, but the scoliosis was really the only other issue. Learning issues haven't really been an issue, I would say. And she would probably agree that if anything, sequential memory sometimes is a little bit tricky. So if given a series of 4 instructions, please go do this, 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 and this, it's a little tricky sometimes to get through all 4 of those things without losing one in the middle. But again, we don't know if that's NF. Is that the surgery? I mean, a very large piece of her brain was removed in that surgery, so we never really know what, the cause and effect is tricky sometimes.
Do you think she would say that she gained anything from having NF?
I think that in some ways, I think she would say that she has learned that it's taught her to maybe not worry about some things that really aren't that important to be worried about. Young people often busy themselves worrying and focusing on just completely benign, silly things that ultimately in the scheme of life don't matter. I think she doesn't take for granted when everything's going well and she's feeling well, that is a great thing, and she tries to take advantage of that.
Can you speak on a little bit of your experiences with NF Midwest?
When she was very young, we very much delved into learning as much as we could. We attended several of the events, the Meet the Doctor events and things like that they used to do in Oak Brook, these very large events. And those were really wonderful for finding some camaraderie and seeing that other people had the same things going on. And a couple of times when I have had questions about where to go for something, or does anyone have a suggestion, it's been a great resource for that. If I'm being completely honest, when she started making it to adolescence, I hope this doesn't sound bad, we kind of made the decision to distance. We were already so involved in so many health things with her that we kind of started, we did distance ourselves a little bit from spending all of our time focusing on enough, because there's other parts of life. So when you're dealing with seizures and trying to get through school and having surgery and all of this stuff, it seemed like it was a little bit, to that point, overwhelming, like everything was about health. So I would say we attended fewer things at that point. It's not that there isn't always new things to learn, but at that point, we kind of felt we knew what we needed to know, and then our time had to be spent addressing these very specific large issues. But other than that, later on, she started getting her own newsletters. She's an adult now, and when she went to college, she was very generously given a scholarship from NF Midwest. They do some scholarships for kids with NF, and she was one of the recipients of those, which was wonderful. It's an incredible organization. I know some people use them and are more affiliated with them for much longer. For us, the big help was when it was new and we just had no idea what we were supposed to do, where to go, who to see. They were an incredible resource.
What advice would you give to a new parent or a new fighter that's like newly been diagnosed?
Probably the hardest lesson that we were told and we didn't learn, and it's because it's just human nature. But I would say a couple of things are really important. The first thing is to use the internet responsibly to learn what you need to learn. The internet is a wonderful resource of information, but it is also a resource of misinformation, and also sometimes tends to skew on the negative side. It's just like anything else. If you look at reviews for something, people are much more inclined to get on and tell you everything that went wrong somewhere than they are to get on there and tell you what a great time they had. And that kind of happens with NF as well. So when you get on the internet, when you first hear that term that you've never heard before, it is overwhelming, and a lot of it is very, very scary. And even some of the things that I've just spoken about, while they sound very scary, and they have been, this is an adult age person who's in college, employed, very independent, and having a very, what I would consider, normal, nice life, despite the fact that it hasn't been a super easy low symptom case of NF. So there is a really overused term, especially in the last year, which is the new normal. And I think you just have to sort of, accept the fact that it is a new normal, and then find the correct resources and responsibly do your research so that you don't, because it's very easy when you first get this information to just sort of bog down into a big ball of depression when you're getting your information from the wrong sources. Another piece of advice is to definitely, if you have the resources insurance wise and geographically, to see people that specialize in this. While it is a common genetic disorder, it is not a well-known genetic disorder, and doctors learn tiny pieces of everything when they go to medical school, but if it's not their field of expertise, they really don't have the knowledge that you need. I know a lot of people that have been with physicians for years who very clearly exhibited multiple symptoms of NF, and they all of a sudden have a child with NF, and as a 28-year-old adult find out that they had it as well, because they were seeing doctors their whole life, so you need to be with reputable people that specialize in NF. It's something that I think that's super important, and not everybody has the ability to do that. I imagine there are resources if you don't, but if you do have those resources, and even if it means, when we take her to her physicians on a good day, 2-hour drive, on a bad day, it's a 3-hour drive, but it's well worth the drive. So that would be my other advice.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and your daughter's story.